My name is Darius Blackwood. I'm an EMT who survived the first 10 days when the Yellowstone supervolcano erupted and plunged America into an Ice Age apocalypse. In those 10 days I watched civilization collapse, made impossible choices between saving lives and surviving, and became someone I barely recognize. This is how I lived through hell on Earth. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I've pronounced over 200 people dead in my career, but I never thought I'd watch an entire civilization flatline. My name is Darius Blackwood, and I'm a 34-year-old emergency medical technician working out of Colorado Springs. I've been doing this job for 12 years. Starting in Detroit, where I learned that death doesn't discriminate, and neither does desperation. I moved to Colorado 2 years ago thinking I'd left the worst behind me. I was wrong. October 23rd, 2024 started like any other Tuesday. I'd been restocking our ambulance outside Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital around 2:30 in the afternoon. The autumn air was crisp but pleasant, maybe 55 degrees. Perfect Colorado weather. I was checking our oxygen supplies when Martinez, my partner, called out from the driver's seat about some breaking news on the radio. Something about seismic activity in Wyoming. I didn't pay much attention at first. We get earthquake reports all the time in Colorado. Part of living near the Rockies. But then I saw it. A flash on the northern horizon that lit up the entire sky like someone had detonated a nuclear weapon. The light was so bright I had to shield my eyes, and for a moment, I thought we were under attack. The flash lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it burned itself into my retinas. That's when the emergency radio exploded with chatter. I've never heard anything like it in my 12 years on the job. Dispatchers were speaking in rapid-fire bursts, their voices cracking with panic. The words didn't make sense at first. Yellowstone, eruption, evacuation, supervolcano. I stood there holding a box of medical supplies, trying to process what I was hearing. Martinez jumped out of the ambulance, his face pale. He'd been monitoring multiple emergency frequencies, and the reports were coming in from everywhere. Park rangers, geological survey teams, air traffic control, all saying the same impossible thing. The Yellowstone supervolcano had erupted. The one scientists had been monitoring for decades, the one they said might blow someday, but probably not in our lifetime. It had just blown. Within minutes, the hospital's disaster protocol alarm started blaring. I'd heard it during drills, but never for real. The sound cut through the afternoon air like a siren announcing the end of the world. Dr. Henderson, our chief of emergency medicine, came running out of the building shouting orders. All ambulances were to report immediately. All staff were to prepare for mass casualty intake. All leave was canceled indefinitely. I remember thinking this was just another drill, maybe a surprise one to test our readiness. But the look in Dr. Henderson's eyes told me otherwise. He'd been practicing emergency medicine for 25 years, and I'd never seen him scared before that moment. He gathered all the EMTs and paramedics in the ambulance bay and told us what he knew. The Yellowstone caldera had experienced what geologists were calling a catastrophic eruption. The ash cloud was already visible on satellite imagery, spreading east and south at unprecedented speed. The hospital administrator, Mrs. Chen, appeared with a clipboard and started implementing emergency generator protocols. She was talking about temporary measures, backup power systems, and supply chain contingencies. Everything sounded routine, like we were preparing for a bad storm. But something in her voice suggested she was reading from a script she'd hoped never to use. She mentioned that the governor had declared a state of emergency and that federal disaster relief was already being mobilized. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the first ash particles began falling. At first, it looked like snow. light gray flakes drifting down from a sky that had turned an unnatural orange color. But when I caught some on my sleeve, it felt gritty and burned slightly when I accidentally inhaled it. This wasn't snow. This was volcanic ash, the pulverized remains of rock and earth that had been ejected from the Earth's crust with the force of 1,000 atomic bombs. The temperature started dropping almost immediately. By 6 o'clock, it had fallen 15 degrees. By midnight, it was down to 32 degrees, in October, in Colorado Springs. I'd lived through Detroit winters, but this was different. This cold felt wrong, like the earth itself was dying. Our first ash-related emergency calls started coming in around 7 o'clock that evening, respiratory distress mostly. People who'd been outside when the ash started falling, breathing in particles that turned their lungs into sandpaper. I responded to a call at a construction site where 3 workers had collapsed after inhaling too much volcanic dust. Their airways were inflamed, their breathing labored. We had to use every respiratory treatment we had just to keep them stable during transport. That's when I started to understand we weren't dealing with a normal disaster. Normal disasters have edges, boundaries. Floods affect certain areas. Tornadoes cut specific paths. Earthquakes shake defined regions. But this ash cloud didn't respect boundaries. It kept spreading, covering everything, turning day into twilight and twilight into something darker. The radio chatter throughout the evening painted a picture that grew more disturbing with each report. Similar conditions were being reported from Denver, Cheyenne, Salt Lake City. The ash cloud was massive, covering multiple states and still expanding. Air traffic was being grounded nationwide. Interstate highways were becoming impassable as visibility dropped to near zero. I went home that night around 2 in the morning. After 18 hours straight. My apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted house near downtown. When I unlocked my door, I could hear the fine ash particles scratching against the windows like tiny claws. The sound was constant, relentless. I tried to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The world I'd woken up and that morning was gone. When I woke up the next morning, October 24th, the sun was gone. Not hidden behind clouds, gone. The sky was a uniform gray-orange color that seemed to press down on everything. The ash had accumulated overnight, covering my car, the streets, the trees. Everything looked like it had been dusted with gray flour. But this flour burned your lungs and stuck to everything it touched. I tried to start my car, and the engine turned over reluctantly. The air filter was already clogged with ash, and I could hear the engine struggling to breathe. I made a mental note that vehicles were going to be a problem if this continued. Mechanical systems weren't designed to operate in these conditions. The drive to the hospital took twice as long as usual. Visibility was maybe 50 feet on a good stretch of road. Other drivers were crawling along, hazard lights flashing, trying to navigate streets that had become alien landscapes overnight. I passed 3 car accidents on the way, vehicles that had slid off the road or rear-ended each other in the poor visibility. When I arrived at the hospital, the parking lot looked like a disaster movie set. Ash covered everything, and the few people moving around were wearing makeshift masks and moving quickly between buildings. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees overnight. It was now 22 degrees, and ice was forming on surfaces that should have been warm. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The emergency department was busier than I'd ever seen it, with people streaming in with respiratory problems, minor injuries from slipping on ash-covered surfaces, and what we were starting to see as the first cases of exposure-related hypothermia. Hypothermia in October, in Colorado. That should have been impossible. Dr. Henderson pulled me aside and explained what they'd learned overnight. The ash cloud was not dissipating. Satellite imagery showed it continuing to spread and actually growing denser in some areas. The National Weather Service was predicting that temperatures would continue to drop as the ash blocked sunlight from reaching the ground. They were calling it a volcanic winter, a phenomenon that could last months or even years. The power grid was starting to show strain. Mrs. Chen had spent the night coordinating with utility companies, and the news wasn't good. Increased heating demand was pushing the electrical systems beyond their normal capacity. There had already been rolling blackouts in some neighborhoods, and the utility companies were warning that more widespread outages were possible. I spent that second day responding to calls that would have been routine a week earlier, but now felt ominous. An elderly woman with chest pains who couldn't get warm despite having her thermostat set to 85 degrees. A family with 3 young children who'd been without power for 8 hours and were showing early signs of hypothermia. Each call drove home the same message. The normal systems people relied on were failing. By evening of the second day, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The emergency radio frequencies that had been buzzing with constant chatter since the eruption were getting quieter. Not because the situation was improving, but because some stations were going offline. Equipment failures, power outages, personnel abandoning their posts. The communication network that held our emergency response system together was starting to fracture. The hospital administrator called an all-hands meeting at 8 o'clock that evening. She stood in front of 40 medical professionals and support staff and delivered news that changed everything. The federal government was classifying the Yellowstone eruption as a national catastrophe. FEMA was overwhelmed and couldn't provide immediate assistance to all affected areas. We were being told to prepare for extended periods of self-sufficiency. Supply trucks that should have delivered medical supplies, food, and fuel were being delayed indefinitely. The interstate highway system was essentially shut down across the western United States. Rail transport was suspended. Even air transport was limited to emergency military flights. We were effectively cut off from the supply chains that kept modern life functioning. That night, I drove home through streets that looked like a war zone. Streetlights were failing, either from power outages or because the ash had covered the photosensors. Cars were abandoned on the sides of roads where they'd broken down or run out of gas. Through the windows of houses, I could see families huddled around fireplaces, trash can fires, anything that could produce heat. I saw something that night that I'll never forget. A family had dragged their dining room table out into their backyard and were burning it piece by piece. The parents were feeding chair legs and table boards into the fire while their children sat as close as they could to the flames. They were burning their furniture to stay warm in America. In 2024, I pulled over and offered to take them to the hospital, but the father just shook his head. He said the hospitals were full, the shelters were full, and they were better off staying in their own home. He thanked me for stopping but said they'd figure it out. As I drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror, silhouetted against the fire they were feeding with pieces of their life. That image haunted me as I tried to sleep that second night. The ash was still falling, still scratching against my windows. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. Ice was forming on the inside of my windows, despite having the heat turned up as high as it would go. My heating bill was going to be astronomical, but I was starting to realize that paying bills might be the least of my problems. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of a world that was shutting down, car alarms going off and then stopping. The distant sound of sirens, but fewer of them than the night before. The constant whisper of ash against glass. And underneath it all, a silence that was growing deeper as the normal sounds of civilization began to fade. I thought about my training, about all the disaster scenarios we'd prepared for. Mass casualty events, terrorist attacks, natural disasters. But nobody had prepared us for this. Nobody had told us what to do when the sky stops working, when the sun disappears, when the very air becomes hostile to human life. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I realized that the comfortable assumption that someone else would handle the big problems, that the government would step in, that supply chains would be restored, that normal life would resume, was crumbling along with everything else. We were entering uncharted territory, and the maps we'd been using to navigate life were about to become useless. The last thought I had before sleep was that this was only day 2, and already the world was becoming unrecognizable. I had no idea how much worse things were about to get, how quickly the thin veneer of civilization could be stripped away when the basic systems that supported it began to fail. I was about to learn that survival wasn't just about medical training or emergency protocols. It was about adapting to a reality that no one had prepared us for, a world where the rules we'd lived by our entire lives no longer applied. By the end of day 2, I realized this wasn't going to be like the training scenarios. This was something none of us had prepared for. Day 3 arrived with a temperature that defied everything I thought I knew about October weather. When I checked the thermometer outside my apartment that morning, it read -5 degrees Fahrenheit, -5. In Colorado Springs. In October. I stared at that number for a full minute, thinking the instrument had to be broken. But when I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a physical blow. The air was so frigid it burned my lungs with each breath. Inside my apartment, ice had formed on the windows. Not just frost, but actual ice crystals growing inward from the glass. I had the thermostat cranked to 85 degrees, and my heating system was running constantly, but it felt like the cold was seeping through the walls themselves. The apartment that had been my refuge for 2 years suddenly felt fragile and temporary. The drive to the hospital that morning was treacherous. My car barely started, and I had to scrape a 1/4 inch of ice from the windshield before I could see anything. The roads were sheets of black ice, covered with a layer of volcanic ash that made traction nearly impossible. I saw 6 abandoned vehicles on the 3-mile drive to work, cars that had either slid off the road or simply stopped running in the extreme cold. When one arrived at Presbyterian St. Joseph, the scene was unlike anything I'd witnessed in my 12 years as an EMT. The emergency department was packed beyond capacity. Every bed was occupied, and patients were lying on gurneys in the hallways. But these weren't the usual emergency cases. These were people suffering from hypothermia. Severe hypothermia. In October, Dr. Henderson looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 3 days. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept. He pulled me aside as soon as I walked in and explained the situation. They'd received 47 hypothermia cases in the past 12 hours. 47 people whose core body temperatures had dropped to dangerous levels simply from being inside their own homes. The first case I saw that morning was a family of 4 from the north side of town. The parents, both in their 30s, and 2 children, ages 6 and 8. They'd been brought in by a neighbor who found them huddled together in their living room, barely conscious. Their house had lost power sometime during the night, and without heat, the interior temperature had dropped to below freezing. The children's lips were blue, and their small bodies were shaking uncontrollably. We immediately began rewarming procedures, but our equipment was being pushed to its limits. The hospital's heating system was struggling to maintain normal temperatures, and the emergency department felt more like a refrigerator than a medical facility. I watched nurses wrapping patients in every blanket we had, but it wasn't enough. The cold was winning. While treating the family, I noticed something through the emergency department windows that made my stomach drop. Ice was forming on the inside of the hospital windows. The same ice crystals I'd seen at my apartment were growing inward from the glass, despite the building's heating system running at maximum capacity. If a modern hospital couldn't maintain proper temperatures, what hope did individual homes have? Around 10 o'clock that morning, I overheard a conversation between Mrs. Chun and the hospital's maintenance supervisor that filled me with dread. The heating system was consuming fuel at 3 times the normal rate, and their primary supplier was unable to deliver due to road conditions. They had maybe 48 hours of fuel remaining if consumption continued at current levels. After that, the hospital would be as cold as everywhere else. Dr. Henderson assigned me to a call that took me into the residential neighborhood south of downtown. A 70-year-old woman named Eleanor Martinez had activated her medical alert system. When I arrived at her small ranch house, I found her in her kitchen, wearing every piece of clothing she owned. She had her oven turned on with the door open, trying to heat the room. The gas flame was providing some warmth, but I could see her breath in the air. Eleanor explained that her power had gone out around midnight, and she'd been slowly getting colder ever since. She'd burned newspapers, magazines, even some of her late husband's books to try to stay warm. The coffee table in her living room was partially disassembled, with 2 of its legs missing. She'd been feeding furniture into her fireplace piece by piece, but she was running out of things to burn. What struck me most about Eleanor wasn't her physical condition, though she was clearly hypothermic. It was her resignation. She sat in that freezing kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of her life that she'd been burning for warmth, and she told me she understood that things weren't going back to normal. She'd lived through the Great Depression, she said, and she recognized the signs of a world that was changing permanently. I transported Eleanor to the hospital, but as we drove through the neighborhoods, I saw scene after scene that reinforced her words. Houses with smoke pouring from makeshift chimneys where people had broken through walls to create ventilation for fires. Families sitting in their cars with the engines running, trying to stay warm while their fuel lasted. Children playing in the ash-covered streets, their breath visible in the frigid air. The radio chatter during that transport was more disturbing than the scenes outside. Emergency frequencies that had been busy with constant reports for 3 days were getting quieter. Not because emergencies were decreasing, but because equipment was failing. Repeater towers were losing power. Dispatch centers were going offline. The communication network that coordinated our emergency response was breaking down. I heard one dispatcher trying to reach units in the eastern part of the county, but getting no response. She kept repeating call signs, her voice growing more desperate with each attempt. Finally, she announced that all units in the Eastern District were presumed offline due to equipment failure. In just 3 days, we'd lost contact with an entire section of our coverage area. Back at the hospital, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The emergency department was so overcrowded that we were treating patients in the parking garage. The loading dock had been converted into a makeshift warming center, with people huddled around portable heaters that were rapidly depleting our fuel reserves. Mrs. Chun was making announcements over the hospital's PA system, asking families to consider taking stable patients home to free up beds for critical cases. But here's the thing that made those announcements meaningless. Home wasn't safe anymore. The houses that people called home were as cold as the outdoors. The heating systems that had kept families comfortable were failing under the extreme conditions. Taking someone home from the hospital wasn't discharge, it was exposure. I spent the afternoon responding to calls that painted a picture of systematic failure. An apartment complex where the heating system had frozen and burst, flooding the building with water that then turned to ice. A grocery store where the refrigeration units had failed, but it didn't matter because the ambient temperature was cold. Enough to freeze everything anyway. A gas station where the pumps had stopped working because the fuel lines had frozen solid. Each call drove home the same message. The infrastructure we depended on wasn't designed for these conditions. Modern heating systems, plumbing, electrical grids, all of it was failing under the assault of temperatures that were supposed to be impossible for this region and this time of year. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of how quickly society could unravel. I was transporting a hypothermia patient to the hospital when I saw a group of people breaking into a sporting goods store. Not homeless people or obvious criminals, but ordinary citizens. A man in a business suit, a woman with children, elderly people who looked like they'd never broken a law in their lives. They were stealing sleeping bags, camping equipment, anything that might help them survive the cold. The police weren't responding to the break-in because they were overwhelmed with emergency calls. Or maybe because they understood that traditional law enforcement had become irrelevant when the alternative to theft was freezing to death. I watched these people, these normal citizens, cross a line they'd probably never imagined crossing. They were taking what they needed to survive, and the social contracts that had prevented such behavior were dissolving along with everything else. That evening, Mrs. Chun called another all-hands meeting. This time, her message was blunt and terrifying. The hospital had enough fuel for heating for perhaps another day. After that, we would be operating in the same conditions as everywhere else. She was asking for volunteers to help organize the evacuation of non-critical patients. Evacuation to where? She couldn't say. The warming centers were full. The hotels were full. Private homes were as cold as the hospital would soon be. She also delivered news that explained why the supply trucks hadn't arrived. The interstate highway system across the western United States was impassable. Not just difficult, impassable. Semi-trucks were abandoned on highways where they'd jackknifed or broken down. Fuel was freezing in the lines. Drivers were abandoning their vehicles and walking to find shelter. The supply chain that moved food, medicine, and fuel across the country had simply stopped. The military was attempting to airlift supplies to major cities, but aircraft were having difficulty operating in the ash-laden atmosphere. Several transport planes had crashed after ash clogged their engines. Even our most advanced technology was no match for the simple reality of volcanic ash and extreme cold. That night, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. I started keeping extra medical supplies in my personal vehicle. Not borrowing them, not checking them out through proper channels, but taking them. I filled a duffel bag with 4 fluids, medications, bandages, and emergency equipment. I told myself it was for emergency calls, but I knew the truth. I was preparing for the possibility that the hospital would no longer be a reliable source of medical supplies. As I drove home through streets that were becoming increasingly abandoned, I saw military vehicles for the first time. Humvees and transport. Trucks moving slowly through the ash-covered roads. Soldiers in heavy winter gear manning checkpoints at major intersections. The sight should have been reassuring, but something about their presence felt ominous. These weren't relief operations. These were preparations for something worse. I stopped at one checkpoint, and a young soldier approached my ambulance. His face was grim, and his breath formed clouds in the frigid air. He asked where I was heading and advised me to stay off the roads after dark. When I asked why, he said, there had been incidents. People desperate for food, fuel, or shelter were becoming unpredictable. The military was trying to maintain order, but they were as overwhelmed as everyone else. When I finally reached my apartment that night, I found a note taped to my door from my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She was an elderly woman who lived alone, and her note was simple: power out. Very cold, please check on me. I knocked on her door and found her sitting in her living room, wearing multiple layers of clothing and wrapped in every blanket she owned. She was burning mail and newspapers in a metal trash can, trying to generate enough heat to stay alive. I helped Mrs. Patterson move into my apartment, which still had power and heat. She spent the night on my couch, and we talked about what was happening to our world. She'd lived through World War II, the Cold War, multiple recessions, and countless crises. But she'd never seen anything like this. She'd never experienced a situation where the basic systems that supported human life simply stopped working. Mrs. Patterson told me something that night that I'll never forget. She said that in all the disasters she'd lived through, there had always been somewhere else to go. If your city was in trouble, you could move to another city. If your state was having problems, you could relocate to another state. But this was different. This was everywhere. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to evacuate to. We were all trapped in a world that was becoming hostile to human life. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Mrs. Patterson's labored breathing and the constant scratch of ash against my windows, I realized that day 3 had marked a turning point. We'd moved from emergency response to something else entirely. We were no longer dealing with a temporary crisis that would be resolved by outside help. We were adapting to a new reality where the old assumptions about how the world worked no longer applied. The power grid that had seemed so reliable was failing. The supply chains that had delivered everything we needed were broken. The communication systems that connected us to the outside world were going silent. The heating systems that kept us comfortable were overwhelmed. Even the hospital, the place that was supposed to be a refuge in times of crisis, was becoming as vulnerable as everywhere else. Day 4 began with the complete failure of the power grid in over half of Colorado Springs. I woke up to darkness and silence. No electricity, no heat, no hum of civilization. Just the sound of ash falling and the distant echo of car alarms that were slowly dying as their batteries failed. The temperature outside had dropped to -15 degrees, and ice was forming on the inside of every window in my apartment. Mrs. Patterson was still alive, but barely. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin had taken on a grayish color that I recognized from my years as an EMT. She was hypothermic despite being inside a heated building. I wrapped her in additional blankets and used my body heat to try to warm her, but I knew she needed professional medical care. The drive to the hospital that morning was the most dangerous of my life. My ambulance barely started, and I had to use a portable heater to warm the engine block before it would turn over. The roads were sheets of ice covered with ash, and visibility was maybe 20 feet. I passed dozens of abandoned vehicles, some with their doors open, where people had simply walked away when the cars stopped running. When I arrived at Presbyterian St. Joseph, I found a scene that defied everything I thought I knew about modern medicine. The hospital's main power was out, and they were running on backup generators that were struggling to maintain even basic lighting. The heating system had failed completely, and the interior temperature was maybe 40 degrees. Medical staff were working while wearing winter coats and gloves. Dr. Henderson met me at the ambulance bay, and his first words were a question I'd never heard from him before. "Do you have any fuel?" The hospital was critically low on diesel for the generators, and without fuel, even the backup power would fail within hours. I had maybe a quarter tank of gasoline in my ambulance, but that wouldn't help their diesel generators. The emergency department was a scene of controlled chaos. Patients with severe hypothermia were being treated in rooms that were nearly as cold as the outdoors. Nurses were using their own body heat to try to warm IV fluids before administering them. Doctors were performing procedures while wearing heavy gloves that made delicate work nearly impossible. I helped transfer Mrs. Patterson to a bed, but there was little the hospital could do for her that I hadn't already done. The warming equipment was failing, the heating system was down, and the medical staff were fighting a losing battle against the cold. Dr. Henderson pulled me aside and told me something that changed everything. They were preparing to evacuate the hospital. The evacuation plan was simple in concept, but impossible in execution. They needed to move over 200 patients to other facilities, but every hospital in the region was facing the same problems. The ambulance service was barely functional. The roads were impassable, and there was nowhere to go that was any warmer or better equipped than where we already were. Mrs. Chun gathered the medical staff and delivered news that made the situation clear. The hospital had perhaps 6 hours of fuel remaining for the generators. After that, they would lose all power, including the ability to run life support equipment. Patients who depended on ventilators, dialysis machines, or other powered medical devices would die unless they could be moved to facilities with reliable power. But here's the crucial point. There were no facilities with reliable power. Every hospital in the region was facing the same crisis. The power grid that had seemed so stable and reliable had collapsed under the unprecedented demand for heating. The fuel supply chain that kept backup generators running had broken down. The transportation network that moved patients between facilities was non-functional. I spent that morning helping to organize the evacuation, but it quickly became clear that we were attempting the impossible. The first ambulance to leave the hospital with critically ill patients broke down less than 2 miles from the building. The second ambulance made it to the receiving hospital, only to find that facility was also evacuating its patients. The third ambulance never made it out of the parking lot because the engine wouldn't start in the extreme cold. Around noon, I overheard a radio conversation that confirmed my worst fears. The dispatcher was trying to coordinate emergency responses across the city, but most units were either non-functional or unreachable. The eastern districts, which had gone silent the day before, were now presumed to be completely without emergency services. The western districts were reporting equipment failures and personnel shortages. The communication network that coordinated our response to emergencies was disintegrating. I was assigned to check on a nursing home on the south side of town, a facility that housed 60 elderly residents. When I arrived, I found the building dark and cold. The administrator met me at the door with tears in her eyes. They'd lost power 18 hours earlier, and the backup generator had failed after running for 6 hours. 60 elderly people were trapped in a building that had become a freezer. The nursing staff had done everything they could. They'd moved all the residents into the central dining room and created a makeshift warming area using portable heaters and propane tanks. They'd wrapped the residents in every blanket they could find. But it wasn't enough. 3 residents had already died from hypothermia, and several others were in critical condition. I called for additional ambulances to help evacuate the nursing home, but the dispatcher told me something that made my blood freeze. There were no additional ambulances available. Every unit in the city was either broken down, out of fuel, or already committed to other emergencies. I was on my own. I made multiple trips between the nursing home and the hospital, transporting the most critical residents in my ambulance. But each trip took over an hour because of road conditions, and I could only take 2 patients at a time. The mathematics were simple and terrible. I couldn't evacuate 60 people before they died from the cold. On my 3rd trip back to the nursing home, I found that 2 more residents had died. The administrator was now talking about the possibility of losing everyone in the building. She asked me a question that I'll never forget. How do I decide who gets saved first? I'd been trained to make triage decisions in mass casualty events, but this was different. This was choosing who would live and who would die based on the simple reality that there weren't enough resources to save everyone. That afternoon, I witnessed the first act of organized violence I'd seen since the crisis began. A group of people had broken into a hardware store and stolen everything they could carry: generators, heaters, propane tanks, tools. But this wasn't the desperate scavenging I'd seen the day before. This was coordinated, planned, and executed by people who clearly knew what they were doing. When I stopped to check if anyone was injured, one of the men approached my ambulance. He was wearing military-style clothing and carrying what looked like a rifle. He asked if I was carrying medical supplies, and when I said yes, he suggested I might want to share some of those supplies with people who needed them. The implication was clear: give us medical supplies voluntarily, or have them taken forcibly. I gave them a small portion of my supplies, basic first aid materials that wouldn't be critical for life-threatening emergencies. But as I drove away, I realized that I'd just participated in the breakdown of law and order. The social contracts that governed normal behavior were dissolving, and people were taking what they needed to survive regardless of laws or moral considerations. The police weren't responding to theft reports anymore. They were overwhelmed with life-threatening emergencies and didn't have the resources to investigate property crimes. The military checkpoints I'd seen the day before were now manned by soldiers who looked increasingly grim and desperate. They were trying to maintain order in a situation that was rapidly becoming chaotic. That evening, I made another decision that would have been unthinkable just days before. I stopped at a sporting goods store that had been broken into and took winter survival equipment, sleeping bags, camping stoves, thermal clothing, and freeze-dried food. I didn't break in. The store was already open, but I took what I needed. Without paying. I left an IOU with my name and address, but I knew it was meaningless. Money had become irrelevant when the alternative was freezing to death. When I returned to the hospital that night, I found that the evacuation had been suspended. Too many ambulances had broken down, too many receiving facilities had closed, and too many patients had died during transport. Dr. Henderson made the decision to keep the remaining patients at Presbyterian St. Joseph and do whatever they could. With the resources they had, Mrs. Chun gathered the staff and delivered what amounted to a farewell address. The hospital would lose all power within hours when the generators ran out of fuel. After that, they would be providing medical care under the same conditions as everywhere else. No heat, no power, no modern equipment. She thanked everyone for their service and released any staff members who wanted to leave to care for their own families. About half the staff left that night. Nurses, doctors, technicians, and support personnel who decided that their first responsibility was to their own families. I understood their decision, but it left us with a skeleton crew to care for over 100 patients who couldn't be moved. I spent that night in the hospital, using my body heat to keep Mrs. Patterson warm. She was still alive, but barely. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and her pulse was weak. I held her hand and talked to her, telling her stories about my time in Detroit, about the calls I'd run, about the people I'd saved. I don't know if she could hear me, but talking helped me stay focused on something other than the cold. Around midnight, the generators finally ran out of fuel. The hospital plunged into complete darkness and silence. The only sounds were the labored breathing of patients and the constant scratch of ash against the windows. Dr. Henderson made an announcement using a battery-powered megaphone. They would continue to provide medical care as long as possible, but families should prepare for the possibility that their loved ones might not survive the night. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of a world that was shutting down. Car alarms that slowly died as batteries failed. The distant crack of trees splitting in the extreme cold. The occasional sound of something large collapsing under the weight of accumulated ash and ice. And underneath it all, a silence that was growing deeper as the normal sounds of civilization faded away. Day 4 was when I stopped believing someone was coming to save us. That's when I realized the only person who could save me was me. Day 5 began in complete darkness and absolute silence. The hospital generators had died during the night, and Presbyterian St. Joseph had become as cold and lifeless as everywhere else. When I checked on Mrs. Patterson that morning, her breathing had stopped sometime before dawn. I closed her eyes and covered her with a blanket, knowing she was the first of many we would lose to the cold. The temperature that morning was -25 degrees. Inside the hospital, the building that had been our refuge, our symbol of modern medicine and safety, was now a freezer filled with dying people. Ice covered the walls, and our breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Medical equipment that had kept people alive was now useless metal and plastic. Dr. Henderson gathered the remaining staff in the cafeteria and made an announcement that changed everything. The hospital was no longer a medical facility. It was a shelter, and barely that. Anyone who could be moved should be taken home to die with their families. Anyone who couldn't be moved would die here. He apologized to all of us, but said we had reached the limits of what modern medicine could accomplish without power, heat, or supplies. I made the decision to take Mrs. Patterson's body home. Not to a morgue, not to a funeral home, but to her apartment where she belonged. The funeral industry had collapsed along with everything else. Morgues were overwhelmed, and crematoriums were shut down due to power failures. People were burying their dead in backyards, storing bodies in unheated garages, or simply leaving them where they died because there was nowhere else to put them. Loading Mrs. Patterson into my ambulance was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. She weighed almost nothing, and her body was rigid from the cold. I wrapped her in the blanket from the hospital and secured her as gently as I could. This woman, who had survived the Great Depression, who had lived through 8 decades of American history, had died because the basic infrastructure of civilization had failed. The drive to her apartment took 3 hours instead of the usual 20 minutes. The roads were impassable in most places, covered with abandoned vehicles and debris. I had to take detours through neighborhoods where entire blocks of houses stood dark and empty. Some had smoke rising from makeshift chimneys where people had broken through walls to create ventilation for fires. Others showed no signs of life at all. I passed an elementary school where someone had spray-painted "shelter" in large letters across the front doors. Through the windows, I could see dozens of people huddled together in the gymnasium, burning desks and chairs to stay warm. Children and adults pressed together for warmth, surrounded by the ash-covered remnants of their educational materials. School had become survival. At Mrs. Patterson's apartment building, I found that most of the residents had either died or abandoned their homes. The mailboxes in the lobby were overflowing with undelivered mail, and several apartment doors stood open where people had simply walked away from their lives. I carried Mrs. Patterson to her apartment and laid her on her own bed in her own room, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of her long life. When I left her apartment, I took some of her emergency supplies: canned food, bottled water, batteries, candles. I left another IOU, knowing it was meaningless, but I needed those supplies more than she did now. Survival was making me into someone I didn't recognize, someone who took what he needed from the dead without hesitation. On the drive back to the hospital, I heard something on the emergency radio that filled me with dread. The dispatcher was trying to reach units in the western districts, but getting no response. She kept calling the same call signs over and over, her voice growing more desperate with each attempt. Finally, she announced that all units in the western district were presumed offline. In 5 days, we'd lost contact with 3/4 of our emergency response network. The military checkpoints I'd seen over the past few days were now abandoned. Humvees and transport trucks sat empty on street corners, their crews either reassigned or simply gone. Some vehicles had been stripped of useful equipment by civilians desperate for anything that might help them survive. The military presence that was supposed to maintain order had evaporated along with everything else. I stopped at one abandoned checkpoint and found supplies that the soldiers had left behind: military rations, first aid kits, communication equipment, and most importantly, a detailed map showing which areas of the city were considered non-viable. Large sections were marked in red, indicating zones where emergency services were no longer operating, and civilian evacuation was recommended. But evacuate to where? The entire map was turning red. Back at the hospital, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything I could have imagined. Patients were dying in their beds, not from their original medical conditions, but from hypothermia. The emergency department that had been overflowing with people seeking help was now nearly empty. Not because the emergencies had stopped, but because people had given up trying to reach help that no longer existed. Dr. Henderson was making rounds with a flashlight, checking on patients and making impossible decisions. Who got the last of the pain medication? Who got the final oxygen tank? Who got moved closer to the small fire they'd built in a metal trash can in the lobby? Every choice meant someone else would suffer more, and he was carrying the weight of those decisions on his shoulders. I found him in the pharmacy, counting the remaining medications by flashlight. He looked up when I entered and asked me a question that haunts me to this day. How do you decide who deserves to live when you can't save everyone? I didn't have an answer then, and I don't have one now. But I was about to learn that survival requires making those choices whether you want to or not. The remaining medical staff had formed into small groups, each taking responsibility for a section of the hospital. Dr. Henderson's group was caring for the most critical patients. Nurse Rodriguez had taken charge of the pediatric cases. I was assigned to work with Dr. Sarah Kim, a surgeon who was treating trauma cases without proper equipment or anesthesia. We were practicing medicine like doctors had practiced 200 years ago, before modern technology, before reliable power, before the infrastructure we'd taken for granted. Dr. Kim and I were treating a man who'd been injured when his roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated ash and ice. He had internal bleeding that would normally require immediate surgery in a fully equipped operating room. Instead, we were working by flashlight in a cold storage room, using basic instruments and no anesthesia. The man was conscious and aware of everything we were doing to him. I held his hand while Dr. Kim worked, talking to him constantly to try to distract him from the pain. He told me about his family, his wife and 2 young children who were trapped in their house when the roof came down. He'd managed to dig them out, but he didn't know if they were still alive. He begged me to check on them after we finished the surgery to make sure his family was safe. Dr. Kim saved the man's life, but just barely. Without proper equipment or post-operative care, his chances of survival were minimal. We moved him to a bed near the trash can fire in the lobby, wrapped him in every blanket we could find, and hoped for the best. I promised him I would check on his family, though I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep that promise. The man's address was in the Eastern District, the area that had gone silent on the radio 3 days earlier. I hadn't been to that part of the city since the crisis began, but I felt obligated to try. I loaded my ambulance with as many medical supplies as I could carry and headed east through streets that looked like a war zone. The Eastern District was a wasteland. Entire blocks of houses had been abandoned, their windows dark and their driveways filled with snow and ash. Cars sat where they'd died, some with their doors open, where people had walked away when the vehicle stopped running. Street signs were bent or fallen, and traffic lights hung dark and useless from their cables. I found the man's house, or what was left of it. The roof had indeed collapsed, crushing the front half of the building under a pile of debris, ash, and ice. I called out, hoping to hear voices from inside, but got no response. Using tools from my ambulance, I started digging through the wreckage, looking for signs of life. After 2 hours of digging, I found them. The man's wife and children had been trapped in what used to be the kitchen, huddled together under a fallen beam. They were dead, frozen solid, their arms wrapped around each other in a final embrace. The children couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old. I sat in that destroyed house and cried for the first time since the crisis began. I couldn't bring myself to tell the man what I'd found when I returned to the hospital. He was barely conscious, drifting in and out, due to pain and blood loss. Instead, I told him his family was safe, that they'd been evacuated to a warming center, that they were asking about him. I lied to a dying man because the truth would have killed him faster than his injuries. That afternoon, I made my first deliberate choice to let someone die. An elderly man was brought to the hospital with severe hypothermia, and we had 1 unit of blood that could save his life. But we also had a young mother with the same condition, and she had 3 children, depending on her survival. I made the decision to give the blood to the mother and let the elderly man die. The old man looked at me as he slipped away, and I think he understood what I'd done. He didn't protest or argue. He just squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for trying." I'd violated every principle of medical ethics I'd been taught, but I'd saved a mother who could care for her children. In this new world, those were the kinds of calculations that kept people alive. Dr. Henderson found me sitting alone in a supply closet after the elderly man died, and he told me something that changed my perspective on everything. He said that the medical oath to do no harm was written for a world where resources were abundant and help was available. In our current situation, the greatest harm we could do was to waste limited resources on cases that couldn't be saved when those resources could save lives that had a chance. He was right, but accepting that truth meant accepting that I was no longer the EMT I'd been a week ago. I was something else now, someone who made calculations about the value of human life, based on resource availability and survival probability. The person I'd been before the eruption would have been horrified by the person I was becoming, but that person wouldn't have survived this new reality. That evening, I witnessed the first organized violence I'd seen since the crisis began. A group of about 20 people, led by someone who'd clearly had military training, forced their way into a pharmacy 3 blocks from the hospital. They weren't desperate civilians looking for pain relief. They were organized, armed, and systematic in their approach. I watched from across the street as they loaded trucks with medications, medical equipment, and anything else they could use. When the pharmacist tried to stop them, their leader calmly explained that they were taking what they needed to keep their people alive, and anyone who interfered would be dealt with accordingly. The pharmacist stepped aside and let them take everything. After they left, I talked to the pharmacist. He said this was the 3rd time his store had been cleaned out since the crisis began. The first time, it was desperate individuals taking what they needed for their families. The second time, it was an unorganized mob that destroyed as much as they stole. This time, it was different. This was a functioning organization that took what they needed efficiently and left. The pharmacist told me something that made my blood run cold. The organized group had asked specific questions about medical supplies at other locations. They knew about the hospital's pharmacy, about the veterinary clinic 2 miles away, about the emergency medical supplies stored at the fire station. They were systematically identifying and claiming medical resources throughout the city. When I returned to the hospital that night, I made another decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. I started hiding medical supplies. Not just carrying extra supplies in my ambulance, but actively concealing medications and equipment where they couldn't be found by people who might take them. I was hoarding resources that could save lives because I was afraid they'd be stolen by people who might waste them. Dr. Henderson caught me hiding morphine in a maintenance closet and didn't say anything. He just nodded and walked away. Later, I found out he was doing the same thing. We were all becoming people we didn't recognize, people who lied, stole, and hoarded because the alternative was death. The moral framework we'd lived by our entire lives was dissolving along with everything else. That night, I heard something on the radio that confirmed my worst fears about the future. A ham radio operator was broadcasting reports from other cities, and the news was universally terrible. Denver was completely without power. Salt Lake City had lost most of its population to evacuation or death. Seattle was reporting civil unrest and the complete breakdown of municipal services. The disaster wasn't limited to our area, it was everywhere. The radio operator also broadcast a message from what remained of the federal government. FEMA was suspended indefinitely due to the scope of the disaster. The National Guard was being withdrawn from civilian areas to protect critical military installations. Citizens were advised to shelter in place and await further instructions, but no timeline was given for when help might arrive. I realized that night that we were truly on our own. There was no cavalry coming, no federal relief operation, no return to normal life. The world we'd known was gone, and we were now living in something entirely different. The rules, laws, and social structures that had governed our lives were meaningless when the basic systems that supported civilization had collapsed. Day 6 arrived with news that changed everything. The radio operator who'd been broadcasting reports from other cities went silent, not because his equipment failed, but because he announced that organized groups were taking control of communication equipment and shutting down unauthorized broadcasts. Someone was systematically silencing the independent voices that had been keeping us informed about the outside world. The implications were terrifying. If communication was being controlled, if information was being restricted, then someone was preparing to fill the power vacuum left by the collapse of legitimate government. The organized group that had raided the pharmacy wasn't just looking for medical supplies. They were positioning themselves to control resources and, through that control, to control people. Dr. Henderson called a meeting of the remaining hospital staff and asked a question that nobody wanted to answer. How long before they come for our supplies? We all knew who they were. The organized groups that were forming in the absence of legitimate authority. The people who understood that in a world without law, power belonged to whoever could take it and hold it. We didn't have an answer, but we all understood that our time at the hospital was limited. The building was too large to defend, too visible to hide, and too valuable to ignore. Eventually, someone would decide they needed our medical supplies more than we did, and they'd take them. When that happened, we'd have to choose between fighting a battle we couldn't win or abandoning the patients who depended on us. That afternoon, I made the hardest decision of my life. I chose to abandon the hospital and the patients I'd sworn to protect. Not because I wanted to, but because I finally understood that staying would mean dying, and dying wouldn't help anyone. I took what medical supplies I could carry, said goodbye to Dr. Henderson and the other staff, and walked away from everything I'd believed about duty and responsibility. As I loaded my ambulance for the last time, I looked back at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital. The building that had been a symbol of healing and hope was now a tomb filled with people who would die, because the world had become too hostile to support the kind of medicine we'd practiced just a week earlier. I was abandoning them, but I was also accepting the reality that survival required choices I'd never imagined making. Day 6 was when I stopped believing someone was coming to save us. That's when I realized the only person who could save me was me. Day 7 began with a decision that would have horrified the man I'd been just a week earlier. I was no longer going to answer emergency calls from strangers. The radio in my ambulance crackled with desperate pleas for help, families begging for medical assistance, children crying in the background while parents described symptoms of hypothermia and starvation. I listened to every call, but I didn't respond to any of them. The supply trucks had been gone for 4 days now. No medical supplies, no fuel, no food. What little I had in my ambulance was all that stood between me and death, and I'd made the calculation that saving strangers would kill me. The EMT who had spent 12 years responding to every call, who had driven through blizzards and gang violence to help people he'd never met, was gone. In his place was someone who understood that in this new world, altruism was suicide. I'd spent the night in my ambulance, parked behind an abandoned gas station on the south side of town. The building provided some shelter from the wind, and the location was isolated enough that I wasn't likely to be discovered by the organized groups that were now roaming the city. I'd learned to think like prey, always looking for escape routes, always listening for approaching vehicles, always ready to run. The temperature that morning was -30 degrees. My ambulance barely started, and I had to use a small camping stove to warm the engine block before it would turn over. The fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, and I knew that finding more gasoline was becoming impossible. Gas stations had been drained days ago, either by legitimate customers in the early panic or by people who'd simply taken what they Needed when money became meaningless. I'd made contact with 3 other survivors over the past 24 hours, and together we'd formed what could generously be called an alliance. Marcus was a hospital security guard who'd abandoned his post the same day I left. He had weapons training and understood how to defend a position. Jennifer was a nurse from the pediatric ward who'd saved what medical supplies she could carry when the hospital lost power. Carlos was a maintenance worker who knew the city's infrastructure better than anyone else I'd met. Our alliance was born out of necessity rather than friendship. Each of us had skills that the others needed, and none of us could survive alone. In a city that was rapidly becoming lawless, Marcus provided security and tactical knowledge. Jennifer brought medical expertise and supplies. Carlos knew where to find resources like food, tools, and shelter. I contributed my medical training and the ambulance, which gave us mobility that most survivors didn't have. We'd agreed to meet at a warehouse district on the east side of town, an area that had been marked as non-viable on the military maps. I'd found the designation meant emergency services weren't operating there, but it also meant the organized groups were less likely to patrol the area. We were trading safety for isolation, gambling that being forgotten was better than being noticed. The drive to the warehouse took 2 hours through streets that looked like the aftermath of a war. Entire blocks had been burned, some accidentally. When people lost control of fires they'd built for warmth, others deliberately by groups, marking territory or destroying resources they couldn't control. The skeletal remains of buildings stood like monuments to a civilization that had collapsed in less than a week. I passed an elementary school where someone had hung a white sheet from the flagpole. Bodies were visible through the classroom windows, small forms that had been arranged in neat rows and covered with blankets. Children who died of hypothermia while taking shelter in a building that should have been safe. Someone had written, "They deserved better," in spray paint across the front doors. The warehouse district was a maze of industrial buildings and loading docks, most of which had been abandoned even before the crisis. Carlos had chosen a facility that had previously stored automotive parts, reasoning that it would have minimal value to scavengers and plenty of space for us to set up a defensible position. The building was concrete and steel, built to withstand severe weather, with multiple exits and good visibility of the surrounding area. Marcus was already there when I arrived, his vehicle hidden inside one of the loading bays. He'd been a security guard for 8 years before joining the hospital staff, and his military bearing was evident in how he positioned himself to watch all approaches to the building. He carried a shotgun and had a pistol on his hip, weapons he'd acquired from the hospital security office before abandoning his post. Jennifer arrived 30 minutes later, driving the small sedan that was packed with medical supplies she'd taken from the pediatric ward. She looked exhausted and traumatized, but her nursing training was evident in how she immediately began organizing the supplies and setting up a basic medical station. She'd seen children die in her arms as the hospital lost power, and the experience had hardened her in ways that were visible in her eyes. Carlos was the last to arrive, and he brought news that changed our understanding of what was happening in the city. The organized groups weren't just random collections of survivors. They were functioning hierarchies with clear leadership structures, territorial boundaries, and systematic approaches to resource acquisition. Some were led by former military personnel who understood tactics and logistics. Others were controlled by criminals who'd been prepared for the breakdown of law and order. He'd observed one group that had taken control of a 3-block area around a shopping center. They'd established checkpoints at all entrances, posted guards on rooftops, and were systematically stripping nearby buildings of anything useful. They weren't just surviving, they were building the foundation of a new social order based on strength and resource control. Another group had claimed the municipal airport and was using it as a base for operations throughout the southern part of the city. They had vehicles, weapons, and what appeared to be military-grade communication equipment. Carlos had watched them conduct organized raids on pharmacies, grocery stores, and medical facilities. They moved like soldiers, with coordination and discipline that suggested professional training. The implications were clear. We weren't just competing with other desperate survivors for resources. We were operating in territory that was being claimed and controlled by groups that had the organization and firepower to enforce their will. Our little alliance of 4 people with minimal weapons and supplies was completely outmatched by what was emerging from the chaos. Marcus laid out the tactical situation with military precision. The organized groups controlled the most valuable resources, medical facilities, food distribution centers, fuel depots, and communication equipment. They were expanding their territory systematically, either absorbing smaller groups or eliminating them as threats. Independent survivors like us were being forced into increasingly marginal areas where resources were scarce and survival was questionable. We had perhaps 2 weeks of food if we rationed carefully, medical supplies for maybe a month if we used them sparingly, fuel for less than a week of normal driving. Water wasn't yet a problem because we could melt snow and ice. But that would change when spring came and the accumulated ash contaminated natural water sources. In every category that mattered for long-term survival, we were operating on borrowed time. Jennifer raised the question that none of us wanted to address. What happened when we encountered other survivors who needed what we had? The moral framework that had governed our professional lives was clear about helping people in need, but that framework assumed abundant resources and functioning support systems. In our current situation, helping strangers could mean death for our group. The question became practical rather than theoretical when we heard voices outside the warehouse. A family with young children was moving through the area, searching buildings for shelter and supplies. We could hear them through the walls. A man, a woman, and at least 2 children who sounded very young. They were cold, hungry, and desperate. In the old world, any of us would have helped them without hesitation. Marcus positioned himself near a window where he could observe the family without being seen. He reported that they appeared to be unarmed and genuinely desperate rather than part of an organized group. The children were showing signs of severe hypothermia, and the adults were struggling to carry them. They would probably die if they didn't find shelter and medical attention soon. We faced our first test as a group: save the family and risk our own survival, or let them die to preserve our resources. The calculation was brutal but simple. We had limited medical supplies, minimal food, and barely enough shelter for 4 people. Adding a family of 4 would stretch our resources beyond the breaking point and increase our visibility to the organized groups that controlled the area. I made the decision that still haunts me. I told the group we couldn't help the family. Not because I didn't want to, but because I understood that our survival depended on making hard choices that prioritized our group over strangers. Jennifer argued for helping them, pointing out that we were medical professionals with an obligation to save lives. Carlos supported my decision, noting that additional people would compromise our operational security. Marcus settled the debate with a simple observation: if we helped this family, word would spread that we had medical supplies and were willing to use them to help strangers. Other desperate people would come looking for help, and eventually we'd attract the attention of the organized groups who would take everything we had. Helping one family would ultimately result in our deaths and the deaths of everyone we tried to help afterward. We listened to the family search the building next to ours for over an hour. We heard the children crying from cold and hunger. We heard the parents trying to comfort them with promises that help would come, that they'd find somewhere warm to stay. Eventually, the voices faded as they moved on to search other buildings. I never found out what happened to them, but I can guess. That afternoon, Carlos led us on a reconnaissance mission to identify potential resource sources in our area. We needed to understand what was available, what was already claimed by other groups, and what routes we could use to move safely through the district. The information would be crucial for our long-term survival, but it also meant leaving the relative safety of our warehouse. We traveled in 2 vehicles, staying in radio contact and maintaining visual distance to avoid presenting a single target. The streets were treacherous with ice and abandoned vehicles, but they were also mostly empty. The area had been evacuated or abandoned by most survivors, leaving behind a landscape of empty buildings and scattered debris. We discovered a veterinary clinic that had been overlooked by the organized groups, probably because they were focusing on human medical facilities. The building was locked and appeared undamaged, which meant it likely contained medical supplies that could be adapted for human use. Antibiotics, pain medications, surgical instruments, and basic medical equipment that could supplement our limited supplies. Carlos also identified a restaurant supply warehouse that might contain canned goods and preserved foods. The building was large and isolated, which suggested it hadn't been thoroughly searched by other survivors. Most people were focusing on grocery stores and convenience shops, not thinking about commercial food storage facilities. Marcus found something more troubling: evidence that one of the organized groups was expanding into our area. Fresh tire tracks in the snow, cigarette butts that couldn't be more than a day old, and spray-painted symbols marking buildings they'd searched. They weren't actively patrolling the district yet, but they were clearly planning to claim it. The discovery forced us to accelerate our timeline. Instead of establishing a long-term base at the warehouse, we needed to gather what resources we could and prepare to move to an even more remote location. The area we'd thought was safely forgotten was about to become contested territory, and our small group couldn't compete with organized forces. That evening, we made our first deliberate raid on the veterinary clinic. The operation was planned like a military mission, with specific roles for each person and contingency plans for various scenarios. Marcus provided security, watching for approaching vehicles or people. Jennifer and I entered the building to identify and collect medical supplies. Carlos served as our driver and communications coordinator. Breaking into the clinic felt like crossing another moral line. I'd taken supplies from abandoned locations before, but this was different. This was deliberate theft from a business that might still have legitimate owners. But the business wasn't operating. The owners were probably dead or evacuated, and the supplies would save lives. I rationalized the theft as a necessary adaptation to circumstances, but I knew I was becoming someone I wouldn't have recognized a week earlier. The clinic was a treasure trove of medical supplies. Antibiotics that were crucial for treating infections and unsanitary conditions. Pain medications that could make the difference between manageable suffering and unbearable agony. Surgical instruments that would allow us to treat trauma injuries. Most importantly, we found equipment for field medicine, portable diagnostic tools, emergency surgical kits, and supplies designed for use outside of traditional medical facilities. Jennifer was methodical in her selection of supplies, choosing medications and equipment based on their versatility and shelf life. She avoided specialized veterinary drugs in favor of broad-spectrum antibiotics and pain relievers that would be effective for human patients. Her nursing experience was evident in how quickly she identified the most valuable items and organized them for efficient transport. We completed the raid in less than 30 minutes and returned to the warehouse without encountering other people. But the operation had shown us how vulnerable we were. Any organized group with superior numbers or firepower could take everything we'd acquired. Our success in gathering resources made us a more valuable target, which increased our danger rather than improving our security. Carlos had been monitoring radio frequencies while we conducted the raid, and he'd intercepted communications between organized groups that confirmed our worst fears. They were coordinating their expansion into new territories, sharing information about resource locations, and establishing protocols for dealing with independent survivors. We weren't just competing with random scavengers. We were operating in an environment where survival required military-level organization and capabilities. That night, we held a group meeting to plan our next moves. The warehouse was no longer a viable long-term location. The organized groups were expanding into our area, and we couldn't defend against a coordinated assault. We needed to find a more remote location, possibly outside the city entirely, where we could establish a base that would be overlooked by larger groups. Marcus had identified several potential locations during his reconnaissance, including an abandoned mining facility in the mountains west of the city. The location was remote enough to avoid casual discovery, but it would also mean giving up access to urban resources. We'd be trading safety for isolation, gambling that we could survive on what we could carry rather than what we could scavenge. Jennifer raised concerns about medical care in a remote location. Without access to hospital equipment or pharmaceutical supplies, our ability to treat serious injuries or illnesses would be severely limited. Anyone who suffered a major trauma or developed a serious infection would probably die regardless of our medical training. Carlos pointed out that staying in the city meant eventual confrontation with organized groups, and confrontation meant death. The groups weren't interested in negotiation or cooperation with independent survivors. They saw us as threats to be eliminated or resources to be absorbed. Our medical supplies made us valuable enough to target, but our small numbers made us easy to overwhelm. I made the decision that would define our group's future. We would leave the city and establish a base in the mountains. Not because it was the best option, but because it was the only option that offered any hope of long-term survival. We would become refugees in our own country, abandoning the civilization we'd known for a primitive existence based on basic survival. The decision meant accepting that we were no longer medical professionals serving our community. We were a small tribe focused on our own survival, willing to let others die to preserve our own lives. The transformation was complete. The people we'd been before the eruption were gone, replaced by versions of ourselves that could function. In a world where humanity had reverted to its most basic survival instincts. Day 8 was when I stopped being an EMT and became something else entirely. Something I needed to be to survive what was coming. Day 9 brought us face to face with the ultimate test of who we'd become. We were loading our vehicles for the journey to the mountains when we discovered another group of survivors had taken shelter in the warehouse next to ours. Through the thin walls, we could hear children crying and adults discussing their dwindling medical supplies. A child was sick, probably with pneumonia based on them coughing we could hear, and they were debating whether to risk traveling to find help. Marcus had spotted them during his morning security check. 7 people total, 2 families who'd banded together for survival. They had children ranging from maybe 4 to 12 years old, and at least one of the kids was seriously ill. They'd found antibiotics somewhere but weren't sure about proper dosages. They were discussing the possibility of trying to reach a hospital, not knowing that the hospitals had been abandoned days ago. Jennifer immediately wanted to help. Her nursing instincts were stronger than her survival calculations, and she argued that we had the medical knowledge and supplies to save the child's life. It would only require a small amount of our antibiotics and maybe 20 minutes of medical attention. In the old world, the decision would have been automatic. You help a sick child because that's what decent people do. But this wasn't the old world, and we weren't the same people we'd been 9 days earlier. Carlos pointed out that helping these families would reveal our location and our resources to people we didn't know. If they were grateful, they might tell others about our medical supplies. If they were desperate, they might try to take everything we had. Either way, contact with strangers increased our risk of discovery by the organized groups that were expanding into this area. Marcus was more direct in his assessment. He'd observed the families long enough to determine they were poorly organized, inadequately supplied, and incapable of defending themselves. Helping them wouldn't just cost us resources, it would saddle us with people who couldn't contribute to our group's survival. In his military terminology, they were non-viable assets who would compromise our operational security. The debate wasn't really about medical ethics or humanitarian obligation. It was about resource allocation and survival probability. We had limited antibiotics that might be crucial for our own survival later. We had a secure location that would be compromised by contact with strangers. We had a viable escape plan that would be complicated by additional people. Every argument for helping led to increased risk for our group. I listened to the sick child coughing through the wall and made the hardest decision of my life. I told Jennifer we couldn't help them. Not because the child didn't deserve medical care, but because our survival depended on prioritizing our group over strangers. I'd crossed a line that the EMT I'd been a week earlier would never have imagined crossing. I was choosing to let a child die to protect my own chances of survival. Jennifer stared at me like I'd become a stranger, which I suppose I had. She'd worked pediatric nursing for 6 years, and every instinct she'd developed in that time was screaming at her to save the child next door. But she also understood the mathematics of our situation. We couldn't save everyone, and trying to save this child might result in all of us dying later when we needed those antibiotics for ourselves. The argument was settled by circumstances rather than agreement. Carlos, who'd been monitoring radio frequencies, intercepted communications indicating that the organized group Marcus had identified was conducting a systematic sweep of our area. They were moving building by building, searching for resources and survivors. They would reach our location within hours, which meant we had to leave immediately regardless of what we decided about the neighboring families. We loaded our vehicles as quietly as possible while listening to the families debate their options through the wall. The sick child's condition was deteriorating, and the adults were becoming more desperate in their discussions. They were talking about sending someone to try to find medical help, not realizing that medical help no longer existed in any meaningful sense. As we prepared to leave, Jennifer made a decision that surprised all of us. She took a small bottle of antibiotics and a handwritten note with dosage instructions and left them outside the entrance to the family's warehouse. She didn't make contact or reveal our presence, but she provided the medical intervention that could save the child's life. It was a compromise between her nursing ethics and our survival requirements. Marcus was furious about Jennifer's action, pointing out that the antibiotics and note would reveal that medical professionals had been in the area recently. If the organized group found the evidence, they might intensify their search for us. But the deed was done, and we had to leave before the sweep reached our location. The drive to the mountains took 4 hours through roads that were barely passable. We traveled in convoy, maintaining radio contact and watching for signs of organized group activity. The route Carlos had chosen avoided main highways and major intersections, following back roads and rural routes that were less likely to be patrolled or monitored. We passed through small towns that had been completely abandoned, their main streets empty and their businesses dark. Some showed signs of hasty evacuation, cars with open doors, scattered belongings, houses with front doors standing open to the elements. Others appeared to have been systematically stripped of useful materials, probably by organized groups that had claimed the resources and moved on. The abandoned mining facility Marcus had identified was located 15 miles west of the city, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through forested hills. The location was remote enough to avoid casual discovery, but it also meant complete isolation from any remaining civilization. We were committing ourselves to existence based entirely on what we could produce, find, or take from the immediate area. The facility consisted of several concrete buildings that had been used for mineral processing, along with administrative offices and equipment storage areas. The structures were solid and weatherproof, built to withstand harsh mountain conditions. Most importantly, The location included a natural spring that would provide clean water year-round, assuming the volcanic ash hadn't contaminated the source. Marcus immediately began assessing the defensive capabilities of the location. The facility was situated on elevated ground with good visibility of approaching routes. The buildings could be fortified with minimal modifications, and there were multiple escape routes through the surrounding forest. From a tactical standpoint, it was as secure as we were likely to find without major construction projects. Jennifer set up our medical station in what had been the facility's first aid office, a room that was already equipped with basic utilities and storage space. She inventoried our supplies and calculated that we had enough antibiotics and pain medications for perhaps 2 months if we used them carefully. After that, we'd be practicing medicine like frontier doctors, relying on herbal remedies and basic surgical techniques. Carlos explored the facility's infrastructure and found that much of it was still functional. The electrical system had been powered by diesel generators, and while we didn't have fuel to run them continuously, we could use them sparingly for essential tasks. There were tools in the workshop areas, preserved foods in the cafeteria, and even some industrial chemicals that could be repurposed for medical or survival uses. That first night in the mountains, we held a group meeting to establish the rules that would govern our new community. We were no longer medical professionals serving the public. We were a survival group focused on our own preservation, and that required a different set of principles and priorities. The transformation from civilized professionals to tribal survivors was now complete. Marcus proposed a hierarchy based on practical skills rather than professional credentials. Military and security experience would take priority over medical or technical training, because staying alive mattered more than treating injuries if we were all dead. Jennifer argued for maintaining medical decision-making authority in health-related matters, but she accepted that survival situations would override medical ethics when the two conflicted. We established protocols for resource allocation, with strict rationing of food, medical supplies, and fuel. Every decision about using supplies would be made by group consensus, with survival probability taking priority over individual needs or wants. We were adopting the harsh calculus of triage on a permanent basis, where resources went to whoever could contribute most to group survival. The most difficult rule we established was our policy toward other survivors. We would not automatically help strangers who approached our location. Each situation would be evaluated based on what the strangers could contribute to our group versus what they would cost in resources and security. People who couldn't contribute to our survival would be turned away, regardless of their medical needs or humanitarian situation. Day 10 began with a radio transmission that changed our understanding of what was happening in the outside world. Carlos had been monitoring emergency frequencies when he picked up a broadcast from what remained of the federal government. The message was brief and chilling. Civilian authorities were suspended indefinitely. Martial law was declared nationwide, and citizens were advised to shelter in place until further notice. The transmission also included information about designated survivor zones where government services were still operating. The nearest zone was over 300 miles away, accessible only through territory controlled by organized groups that had been classified as hostile to federal authority. Even if we wanted to try to reach legitimate government assistance, the journey would probably kill us. More disturbing was what the transmission didn't mention. No timeline for restoration of services, no plan for relief operations, no indication that the government had any effective strategy for dealing with the crisis. The federal authorities who were supposed to coordinate disaster response had essentially admitted they were powerless to help the millions of people affected by the volcanic winter. That morning, we encountered our first test of the protocols we'd established the night before. A man approached our facility on foot, carrying the backpack and showing obvious signs of hypothermia and malnutrition. He'd been walking for days, searching for his wife and daughter who'd been separated from him when their shelter was overrun by an organized group. He was asking for medical attention and food, offering to work in exchange for help. Under our old value system, helping him would have been automatic. He was injured, alone, and desperate for basic humanitarian assistance. But under our new survival protocols, he represented a resource drain with minimal potential contribution to our group's security. He was injured, which meant medical supply consumption. He was emotionally compromised by grief, which made him unreliable. He had no useful skills or equipment that would enhance our survival capabilities. Marcus conducted what amounted to an interrogation, determining that the man had no military experience, no medical training, no technical skills, and no information about organized group activities that would be useful for our security. Jennifer examined his injuries and determined that treating him would require antibiotics. We couldn't spare and ongoing medical attention that would drain our supplies. I made the decision to turn him away. We gave him 1 day's worth of food and basic first aid supplies, but we didn't allow him to stay or receive extended medical treatment. I watched him walk away into the forest, knowing he would probably die within days, and I felt nothing. The capacity for guilt or regret about such decisions had been burned out of me by 9 days of impossible choices. Jennifer was disturbed by how easily I'd made the decision, and she asked me when I'd become someone who could watch a man die without trying to save him. I told her the truth. I'd become that person gradually, through a series of choices that each seemed necessary. At the time, the EMT would have risked everything to save a stranger, had died somewhere between day 1 and day 10, replaced by someone who could calculate human worth in terms of resource consumption and survival probability. That afternoon we discovered we weren't as isolated as we'd thought. Carlos found evidence that other groups had used the mining facility recently. Fresh ashes from fires, food containers that couldn't be more than a few days old, and markings on the buildings that indicated systematic searching. We weren't the first survivors to identify this location as viable, and we probably wouldn't be the last. Marcus immediately implemented security protocols, establishing watch schedules and defensive positions throughout the facility. We couldn't assume that other groups would be peaceful or willing to share resources. In a world where cooperation had been replaced by competition, every encounter with strangers was potentially hostile until proven otherwise. The discovery forced us to accelerate our timeline for establishing permanent defenses. We needed to fortify the facility, stockpile resources, and prepare for the possibility of armed conflict with other survivor groups. The peaceful coexistence we'd hoped for was probably impossible in a world where resources were scarce and law enforcement was non-existent. That evening, we received a radio transmission that explained why other groups had been using our location. The organized groups in the city were expanding their territory aggressively, forcing independent survivors to flee to more remote areas. The mountains were filling up with refugees who'd been driven out of urban areas by groups that had superior organization and firepower. The transmission came from a ham radio operator who'd been documenting the expansion of territorial control throughout the region. According to his reports, 3 major organized groups now controlled most of Colorado Springs, with smaller groups claiming territory in the surrounding areas. Independent survivors were being systematically eliminated or absorbed, leaving only organized factions in control of significant resources. The operator also reported that similar patterns were emerging in other cities throughout the western United States. The collapse of legitimate government had created a power vacuum that was being filled by anyone with sufficient organization and violence capability. Democracy and law enforcement had been replaced by feudalism and private armies. His final message was a warning. The organized groups were beginning to expand beyond urban areas, claiming rural resources and eliminating competition from independent survivors. The remote locations that had seemed safe were becoming contested territory as the groups consolidated their power and looked for new resources to exploit. As we listened to the transmission, we realized that our isolation was temporary at best. Eventually, one of the organized groups would expand into our area, and we'd face the same choice that every other independent survivor had faced. Join them, flee to an even more remote location, or fight a battle we couldn't win. Marcus began planning for that eventual confrontation, identifying defensive positions and escape routes that would give us options when the organized groups found us. But we all understood that our small group couldn't compete with organizations that had military leadership, superior numbers, and better equipment. Our survival depended on staying hidden until we could develop the capabilities to defend ourselves or the opportunity to align with a group that shared our values. Jennifer asked the question that none of us wanted to address. What values did we still share? We'd abandoned the medical ethics that had governed our professional lives. We'd rejected the humanitarian principles that had motivated our career choices. We'd adopted survival protocols that prioritized our group over everyone else. What distinguished us from the organized groups we were trying to avoid? The answer was uncomfortable but honest: very little. We'd become a small tribe focused on our own survival, willing to let others die to preserve our own lives. The only difference between us and the organized groups was scale and capability. They had the power to impose their will on others, while we were hiding in the mountains hoping to be overlooked. That night, I reflected on the 10 days that had transformed me from an EMT, dedicated to saving lives, into someone who could calculate the survival value of human beings like livestock. The volcanic eruption had killed my sister, my profession, my community, and ultimately my identity. The person I'd been before October 23rd was as dead as Mrs. Patterson and the countless other victims of the new ice age. But the person I'd become was alive, and that was what mattered in this new world. I'd learned to make impossible choices, to prioritize survival over ethics, to view other people as resources rather than individuals deserving of care. The transformation had been necessary and irreversible. There was no going back to the world we'd lost, and there was no returning to the people we'd been. Day 10 was when I stopped counting days and started counting the lives I could still save. Because in this new world, that's all that matters anymore. The world had changed completely in just 10 days. The comfortable assumptions about civilization, about help coming from outside, about the basic systems that supported human life, had all proven to be illusions. We were living in a reality where survival required abandoning the moral frameworks that had governed our entire lives, where helping strangers could mean death for ourselves, where medical professionals had to choose who deserved to live based on resource calculations. The volcanic winter was just beginning. The organized groups were consolidating power. The government had essentially collapsed. And somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, 4 people who'd once dedicated their lives to helping others were learning to survive in a world that had forgotten what help meant. We'd adapted to the new reality, but the cost of adaptation was everything we'd once believed about human decency and professional obligation. This was our new world, and we were the people. We'd become to survive in it.